The Las Vegas Raiders are facing a big decision as they head into the offseason. While they still have one game left against the Chargers this Sunday, the team will need to start planning for the future once that game is over. Antonio Pierce is one part of the equation, but another important question is who will be their quarterback going forward. This quarterback situation is especially interesting, especially after some news that came out yesterday. Dane Bugler, a draft analyst for The Athletic, shared some insight in an article. In it, he quoted an AFC scout who said something that really stands out. "I feel bad for the teams trying to find even one good quarterback in this group." This comment highlights a key concern about this year's quarterback class. Up to this point, many people consider Cam Ward the top quarterback, but even then, there's uncertainty about whether he's the real deal. If Ward is indeed QB1, he could be the first overall pick, but there are still doubts about whether he can be successful in the NFL. Then there are quarterbacks like Jalen Moreau and Shadir Sanders, who some people think shouldn't even be drafted in the first round. The overall opinion is that this year's quarterback class is quite weak. It's not unusual. Remember, last year 6 quarterbacks were taken in the first round. This year, it seems like the pool is much smaller. If the Raiders were serious about getting a quarterback, they probably should have traded up for one last year, which would have made the most sense. Of course, it's important to remember that trading up for a higher draft pick isn't as simple as it sounds. If a team says you want the 5th overall pick, that'll cost you 3 first-round picks. It's not an easy decision to make. It's tough to commit to giving away so many future picks just for one player, especially if your team has other areas that need attention. Looking back at last year, the Raiders took the best player available approach, and it worked out well. Not only did they grab Brock Bowers, but they also secured Jackson Paris-Johnson in the second round. Going into the upcoming offseason, there will be some big decisions to make. Today we're going to talk about what the Raiders can realistically do for next season. Dane Brugler's article highlighted that an AFC scout feels sorry for teams struggling to find even one decent quarterback in this group. It's not an easy task. I've heard similar things. There's one quarterback who could go in the first round, but the rest aren't seen as first-round talents. That doesn't mean the Raiders won't get a quarterback, though. Teams desperate for a quarterback may still take a chance and reach for one. But when you're in the Raiders' position, it's important to consider all your options carefully. If the Raiders had the 8th overall pick, for example, there could be a solid group of players available. You might find guys like Ask Gent, Abdullah Carter, Josh Conley, the tackle from Oregon, or Will Johnson, the cornerback from Michigan. There are plenty of strong options to choose from without jumping into a risky quarterback pick. The Raiders need to seriously consider taking the best player available with their first pick. After that, they can come back in the second round and possibly select a quarterback. I actually did a mock draft recently, and in it, I took this approach. Get the best player in the first round, then look for a quarterback in the second. This strategy makes a lot of sense for the Raiders. It might not be Jalen Milroe, though. While Milroe has potential, he's still a bit rough around the edges, and we've seen that throughout the season. However, the Raiders could easily decide to go with someone like Will Johnson, who could develop into one of the best cornerbacks in the NFL. Remember, a few years ago, the Denver Broncos took Patrick Surtain even though they needed a quarterback. They took the best player available, and it paid off with Surtain becoming a star. The Raiders could follow that same strategy and pick Will Johnson to strengthen their defense. I also have some thoughts on Ashton Genty, who might be available around that pick. I'll get into that a bit later, as I'm a little hesitant about Genty, and I'll explain why shortly. But for now, the Raiders should stick with the best player available approach. They could then take a quarterback in the second round and even grab a running back in the third. This running back class is incredibly deep, and players like Jalen Slaughter or R.J. Harvey could be solid options. However, I don't think R.J. Harvey will still be there when the Raiders pick at 70. He might end up being a first-round pick. R.J. Harvey will likely go in the top 45 to 60 picks, so it's safe to say he's borderline first-round talent. As we dive deeper into this draft, the Raiders will have to make some tough decisions. They can either take a quarterback in the second round, someone with high potential, or look at other options outside the draft, particularly at veteran quarterbacks. There are some interesting veteran QB targets the Raiders could pursue this offseason. First up, there's Dak Prescott. He might be available. Then there's Kirk Cousins. He's probably going to become a free agent soon, so the Raiders could look to bring him in. Of course, if the Cowboys don't move on from Dak Prescott, that's a bit of a complication, but Kirk Cousins could be a solid choice for the Raiders. If the Raiders aren't interested in those two, they could consider a younger option like Sam Darnold. Personally, I don't think Sam Darnold will be available. Many Raiders fans have been calling for Darnold, but I doubt the Vikings would let him go. He's only 26, and he's shown he can be a legit quarterback. If the Vikings were to move on from a QB, they'd likely trade J.J. McCarthy instead, especially since McCarthy hasn't proven himself as much as Darnold has this season. Another option for the Raiders could be trading for J.J. McCarthy. I wouldn't be upset if the Raiders decided to pursue him, but is he worth the 8th overall pick? That's debatable. A high draft pick is always valuable, and the pick itself might be worth more than McCarthy at this point. When it comes to J.J. McCarthy, while he is a quarterback, I'm not completely sure he's worth the 8th overall pick. With so few quarterbacks in this class, and even fewer available, it's possible the Raiders might decide that trading for McCarthy is worth it. I wouldn't mind seeing the Raiders make that move, but whether McCarthy is truly worth the 8th or 7th pick is up for debate. Another option the Raiders could consider is some aging quarterbacks who might become available. Matthew Stafford, for example, could be on the move. Although the Rams are having success, there are whispers that coach Sean McVay might be ready to move on from Stafford. There are also younger quarterbacks who haven't had the best careers so far but could still be given a fresh start. Justin Fields, Trey Lance, and Zach Wilson are all examples of players who might get a second chance. We've seen quarterbacks like Baker Mayfield, Geno Smith, and Sam Darnold find success in years 4, 5, and 6. So why not give these guys another opportunity? I agree with this line of thinking. The Raiders should definitely consider these other quarterbacks. The alternative, of course, would be sticking with Gardner Minshew and Aiden O'Connell. If the Raiders decide to go this route, it's likely Aiden O'Connell would get the starting job. But I'd be curious to see what Gardner Minshew could do with Scott Turner as his offensive coordinator, especially compared to how things were under Luke Getsy. I know some people might argue that Gardner Minshew is a terrible quarterback, but I think the Raiders' biggest problem this season wasn't necessarily the quarterback. It was their offensive coordinator. Scott Turner has shown that even though the team has been hurt and not performing as well, he's still a much better offensive coordinator than Luke Getsy. If you've been watching the games closely, you can probably see that for yourself. The Raiders have a lot of options when it comes to addressing the quarterback position. They could go after a veteran, stick with what they have, or even look to draft a quarterback in the second round. In my mock draft, I thought Jalen Milroe made the most sense, but I wouldn't be upset if the Raiders decided to go after Jackson Dart instead. He could be a solid pick in the second or third round, and he has potential. The key with these quarterbacks is that you're not likely to start them right away. The Raiders would probably stick with Aiden O'Connell or Gardner Minshew, whoever wins the job. If they end up struggling with a 2-7 record, you could bring in the rookie to see what he can do. If the rookie also struggles, then maybe the Raiders will have a high enough pick next year to grab a quarterback from a stronger class. A guy like Garrett Nesum, who has already declared to return to LSU, is having a standout season, with 3 touchdowns at halftime. Drew Aller from Penn State might even be the first overall pick next year, so it could be tough for teams in need of a quarterback this year. There are some interesting quarterbacks who didn't enter the draft this year. Many people think Drew Aller and Garrett Nesum would have been picked higher than some of the quarterbacks coming out, like Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders. If Drew Aller had declared, he might have been the number 1 overall pick this year, and I agree with that, but we'll have to wait and see how things unfold. Now, if the Raiders decide to go with a quarterback in the second round, there are several names to consider. Carson Beck has already declared he's entering the draft. Jalen Milroe will likely declare soon, but I think it would be smart for him to return to school for 1 more year. However, anything can happen, and we won't know for sure until he announces. Then, of course, you have Cam Ward and Shedeur Sanders, who are 100% coming out as well. Another quarterback to watch is Brady Cook. While he isn't as high profile as some of the other guys, he's definitely an interesting option. Cook played in the SEC and has won a lot of games. He's had a very successful career at Missouri, where the team has consistently won 10 or 11 games each season. Brady Cook has been impressive, with over 40 touchdowns in the past 2 years and very few turnovers. He could be another quarterback to target in the second or third round, or even later, depending on how the draft plays out. Now let's talk about the best player available, BPA approach. Some players are currently being projected in the top 10, but I don't think they'll actually go that high. Guys like Will Campbell, an offensive tackle from LSU, and Mason Grab, a defensive tackle from Michigan, are being ranked much higher than I think they should be. I'd be surprised if either of them ends up in the first round. We'll start to get a clearer picture of where these players will fall over the next few months as the draft gets closer. If you're the Raiders, outside of the quarterback position, I think your biggest needs are at wide receiver and running back. The team absolutely needs to address both positions, and I wouldn't be surprised if the Raiders drafted 2 running backs this year. The running back class is incredibly deep, probably the best we've seen in the last 14 or 15 years. This year's class is head and shoulders above the rest. I mentioned RJ Harvey from UCF earlier, and he's one of the best in this class. He's a very talented running back, and if you look at his stats, you'll see why. As for Aston Genty, a lot of people think he's a top 5 pick, but I'm not fully convinced. While Genty has impressive yardage, it's important to remember that a lot of his production comes from the high number of carries he's had. Ashton Genty's 345 attempts are impressive, but it's a lot of carries. When you look at yards per attempt, he ranks 4th, which is still solid, but not the best. For example, Trayvon Henderson averaged 6.9 yards per attempt, while RJ Harvey from UCF had 6.8, showing that Genty's production isn't the highest in the class. It's also worth noting that Ohio State and UCF tend to play tougher competition than Genty's team. So while Genty is a talented player, there are other running backs in this draft that are worth considering. For the Raiders, taking a running back in the top 10 just doesn't make sense. There are many good backs in this class, and the Raiders could potentially find a good one in the second round. The difference between Genty and a second-round back might not be that significant. Also, Genty's height is a concern. He's listed at 5 feet 7 inches, and if he measures that short, it could hurt his draft stock. Historically, smaller running backs have had a hard time succeeding in the NFL, and no 5'7" back has been taken in the top 15 picks. If I were a team, I'd probably look for a running back in the second or third round. RJ Harvey, Caleb Johnson from Iowa, and even Damon Martinez from Miami are all good options. I think the top 3 running backs in this class are Genty, Harvey, and Johnson. All 3 could go in the first round, but don't be surprised if Genty isn't the first running back taken. Some scouts I've talked to don't think he'll go as high as people expect. The size, competition he's faced, and his high number of carries are all concerns for certain teams. Again, I think Genty will be a solid player, but with this being such a deep running back class, there's a lot of talent to choose from. It doesn't make sense to take a running back in the top 10, especially considering the team's needs and the positions that have a bigger impact on the game. For example, Brock Bowers, a generational talent at tight end, fell to 13th overall. Normally, generational players go in the top 3 or 4, but because tight end is a position that doesn't have the same impact as others, Bowers slipped. Similarly, safety and linebacker are positions that don't usually go in the first round anymore. And running back is in the same category. For the Raiders, I would avoid taking a running back in the top 10. Instead, I'd focus on other impactful positions. For example, I'd look at taking the number 1 cornerback, Will Johnson, who is expected to be the top corner this year. Another option would be the top edge rusher, which could be Abdul Carter, though I'm not entirely sure about that. Josiah Stewart from Michigan had an excellent year, and Mike Green from Marshall is another name to watch. Although the Raiders may not necessarily need an edge rusher, it's a position that still holds a lot of value. Defensive tackle is another position to consider in the top 10, though I'm not as high on the prospects this year as I've been in past years. The defensive tackles available now don't have the same star power as players like Jalen Carter from previous drafts. Lastly, the Raiders could look at wide receiver, and Travis Hunter stands out as the top wideout in this class. He's explosive and a playmaker. Tetrao McMillan isn't far behind him, though he's a different kind of player. McMillan is more of a big, physical wide receiver, similar to Drake London, who surprised people when he was drafted as high as he was. McMillan's size at 6'5" makes him a tough player to cover, and that's why he could be compared to someone like Calvin Johnson, although he's not quite on that level. His length and strength are rare for wide receivers, and he's someone I'd definitely consider for the Raiders, especially since they need a true X wide receiver. Of course, you could target T. Higgins in free agency, but McMillan is another solid option. Travis Hunter would be a dream pick, but he's likely to be the first non-quarterback taken, so he probably won't be available for the Raiders. Another position to consider would be offensive tackle, and Josh Connor is a great candidate. Kelvin Banks and Josh Simmons are also strong prospects. If the Raiders go this route, they could put a player like Connor at right tackle, allowing DJ Glaze to move inside to guard, which could really strengthen the line. I would hesitate to draft a tackle until the Raiders are sure that DJ Glaze is the right guy, but he could still be a valuable guard. Overall, the Raiders have a few good options in the top 10: cornerback, wide receiver, defensive line, or quarterback. When the Raiders are on the clock at pick 7 or 8, I wouldn't be surprised if Shatter Sanders is still available, but something tells me they might skip him. Personally, I'd rather go into the season with Sanders than not, even if it means using a top 10 pick. It seems like teams might not be too high on this draft class, especially at quarterback. They might prefer to grab a top-tier player like Pansu or the next Nick Bosa, rather than take a chance on quarterbacks like Justin Fields or Kenny Pickett. Teams could be thinking it's better to wait until next year for a better quarterback class, and I can understand that approach. The Raiders have a lot to figure out, especially with the draft approaching. Next week, I'll be at the Hula Bowl in Florida, so I won't be making content during that time. But the draft process is heating up, and there are a lot of solid prospects this year. We're looking at strong interior offensive linemen, great wide receivers, and running backs who could have successful NFL careers. It's going to be an exciting year, and I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. If you were the general manager of the Raiders, what would you do? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time with another video.